Hi folks, I'm Chelsea with Greenlight Bookstore. We're just giving people a few seconds to log in. You can find a little bit of information in the chat while you wait about how to buy the book and how to get a discount when you buy through Greenlight. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to host tonight's event with Christopher Beha, presenting his new book, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. He'll be talking with Craig Finn, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. Greenlight storefronts are currently closed and locked, but our community is still here. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. You can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. But they can see your name over in our attendee list, and they'll see your name when you comment in chat or ask questions in our Q&A. If you scroll over to the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a few different icons. One of them is labeled chat. If you open this up, you can use it throughout the event to write comments, talk to other attendees, send hellos to the authors, or give rounds of applause during high points in the conversation. You'll also see an icon down here labeled Q&A. This is where we'll be pulling questions from at the end of the event during the Q&A portion. And if you can post questions there at any time throughout the event as they come to you. And if you see someone else's question that you would really like to see answered, you can upvote it so it appears at the top of our queue as we're pulling those. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our website and social media channels later on. And finally, the reason we are all here tonight, books. Tonight's featured book, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com. Though our stores are closed, we're working with our supplier warehouse for fast direct-to-home shipping. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. And we're offering $5 off on the featured book when you purchase it from Greenlight's website this week. Look for the coupon code in the chat. Our interviewer for this evening is Craig Finn. He's a Minnesota-bred singer-songwriter based in New York City, perhaps best known as the singer of The Hold Steady. The Hold Steady has released 7 LPs, including Thrashing Through the Passion in 2019. Finn released his first solo album in 2012 with 3 additional solo LPs put forth since 2015. Faith in the Future, We All Want the Same Things, and 2019's I Need a New War, which coalesced into a Sign of the Times musical trilogy. Pitchfork has described Finn as a born storyteller who has chosen rock as his medium. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Christopher Beha. He is the editor of Harper's magazine. He's the author of 2 previous novels, What Happened to Sophie Wilder and Arts and Entertainments, and a memoir, The Whole 5 Feet. His writing has appeared in the New York Review of Books, New York Times, and the London Review of Books. He lives in New York City with his wife and family. His new book, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, is sweeping in scope, yet meticulous in its construction, a remarkable family portrait and a masterful evocation of New York City and its institutions. Christopher is going to start us out with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Craig and with all of you. Christopher, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Chelsea. Thank you all for logging in tonight. Thank you to Greenlight for hosting us. I do hope that everyone will buy books from Greenlight. If you've already got a copy of my book, or if you just don't like my work, you should buy something else from Greenlight, but do support Greenlight and whatever your closest independent store is as well. We really need these stores to be ready to open back up when we're ready to get back out there. And I want to thank Craig very much for doing this with me. I'm a huge, huge fan of Craig's work, I have to say, truly, the most recent album, solo album, I Need a New War, is the thing that I'm listening to most right now. It's just an amazing piece of work. Craig has a much larger fan base than I do, so probably there are some people who are watching tonight who are watching because of Craig. But for those of you who are here for me and don't know Craig's work, I really, really, really recommend it. Here's the book, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. I'm just going to read a couple of pages and then we're going to get into a conversation. I'm just reading right from the beginning, so you don't need any particular context here. What makes a life? Sam Waxworth sometimes wondered, self or circumstance? On the day that Waxworth arrived in New York to write for The Interviewer, a man named Herman Nash stood on the rim of the fountain in Washington Square and announced that the world was about to end. After close biblical reading and careful calculation, Nash had settled on November 1st at 10 p.m. as the precise moment of the event he called the Great Unveiling. So far as Waxworth knew, no time zone had been specified. Perhaps it would be an incremental apocalypse. A tourist captured the prediction on video, and more than 50,000 people watched it on TV's that week. Nash appeared at the same time the following Saturday and the one after that, by which point his audience had grown so large that it brought out the police. When he called on his listeners to prepare for a coming battle, at least one took the words literally, throwing a bottle of urine at a mounted officer who lost control of his horse, which ran him out of the park and several blocks up Fifth. All of this was in turn recorded and posted and viewed. Soon it seemed that Armageddon was everywhere. Waxworth wasn't one to find intimations of catastrophe in the pages of a 3,000-year-old assemblage of myth and poetry and legal documents. Waxworth was a philosopher, not by training or occupation, but, he believed, by disposition. He tried to attend to the facticity of things. The world in Waxworth's view was a knowable place once you stripped away the dead tradition and wishful thinking built up over millennia of misunderstanding. For most of human history, and even today in places, such an effort could condemn you to death. Conditions were better in Waxworth's particular moment and milieu, but absolute honesty still required a certain amount of courage. In lieu of rack and ropes, the modern skeptic faced social suspicion and familial disappointment. Faced too his own admitted desire that life should carry more meaning than the facts would bear. Which facts were these? We occupied a tiny corner of the universe, minor planet orbiting a minor star, in an even tinier corner of cosmological time. Still, we wanted all of it, the sun and the moon and the firmament that held them, to be about us. This want had been bred into humanity, selected by nature, so it must have served some purpose once, but it had long outlived its usefulness as far as Waxworth was concerned. What was needed now was to know. For all that, he felt an odd admiration for Herman Nash, who'd made a prediction that could be tested against the world, and in so doing put himself at risk of being wrong. When you stuck to interpreting the past, you could say anything. The sheer amount of available information meant that data could be arranged to support every conceivable idea. The test of knowledge was what it told you about tomorrow. Easy enough to laugh at Herman Nash, but the very things that made his prediction so inviting to mock, its combination of specificity and unlikelihood, were exactly what impressed Waxworth. Nash wasn't using the usual methods would-be prophets relied on to perpetrate their frauds, piggybacking on a reasonably likely outcome, making open-ended predictions that could be fulfilled at any time, spouting vague language that might allow him to alter his claim when the unveiling failed to occur. There was no mistaking his terms. He's probably a lunatic, Waxworth admitted to his editor over dinner during his second week in town, but that's better than being a con artist. There's something inspiring about it when you put it that way, his editor replied. They were eating at Temps Perdu, a neo-bistro on the Bowery. The host had seated them at a red leather banquette near the back of the room. A large mirror hung over the editor's head, and Waxworth saw himself in it, framed by distressed brick and pressed tin. In front of Waxworth waited a foie gras terrine with rhubarb compote. French yé-yé pop played softly from speakers above. They were nearly through their first bottle of red, and the editor, whose name was Max Blakeman, was attempting to order a second. It was the spring of 2009. The global economy was in a state of collapse, and Waxworth understood the magazine industry to be more completely collapsed than most. But Mario Adrian, Teaser co-founder, social media billionaire, had lately purchased The Interviewer, rendering the publication more or less immune from cyclical pressure. So Blakeman had explained when convincing Waxworth to move halfway across the country to write for him, and this introductory dinner seemed designed to prove the point. It really gets to the heart of my philosophy, Waxworth said. You have your own philosophy. Blakeman gave a not quite smile. I've always wanted one of those, but they seem like so much work to maintain. Max Blakeman was attentive and solicitous, but had a way of making this solicitous attention feel like an unearned gratuity. That Waxworth should want to impress his new boss was natural enough, but he also wanted, to a greater degree than professional self-interest could explain, to be liked. He wanted to belong in this place. I believe in getting things wrong. Blakeman smiled in full, almost indulged a laugh. I wish you told me that before I hired you. I thought you were the guy who got everything right. Waxworth was slightly uncomfortable with his recently minted reputation as a seer. He'd been working as a software engineer in Madison the previous fall when his political projection system had correctly predicted the exact count of the Electoral College vote and the outcome of every Senate, House, and gubernatorial race. Naturally, he'd been pleased with the attention that had followed this feat, but there was nothing mystical in what he'd done. Quite the opposite. The numbers had been there all along for anyone who cared to look. Of course, I don't want to be wrong all the time, but it's bound to happen eventually. In the long run, everyone regresses to the mean. There's a philosophy, Blakeman said. In the long run, everyone regresses to the mean. The point is, beliefs should be tested against the world. That's the scientific method. You don't just try to convince people with arguments. You don't put reality to a vote. You set up an experiment and you predict how it will come out. If you're wrong, you modify your theory and you start over. Little by little, you arrive at the truth. So this guy should be embraced for giving his ravings some rigor. If anything, more people should do it. Blakeman leaned back in appreciation. Why all religious people should be like Herman Nash. He looked up as though the headline floated in the air between them. It sounds very shareable. After a pause, he clarified, that's a good thing. Mario is big on shareability. He said the word with cheerful disgust and raised his hand, waving away further thought of the man who was paying for their meal before gesturing again to the waiter for the next bottle. All right, that's enough.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. I'm sorry we can't do this in person, but I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah.
As a way of introduction, I read Chris's first book, What Happened to Sophie Wilder, and spoke about it a lot, even in interviews. And Chris reached out at some point about a year ago and said, thanks for talking about me. And turns out he was a fan as well. So we got together in person and we've become friends. And I was really excited to get an early copy of this. And I read it a few months back and I love it and excited to be talking about it here. I was struck when you just read the absolute open part of, the opening few pages of the book, how it really sets up where everything goes from there. It's an incredible microcosm of that. Yeah. But was that the first scene you wrote of the book? Where did you start with this?
No, so to give the beginnings of some of the plot, this character, Sam Waxworth, has just arrived to New York as is described in that scene. And Max Blakeman gives him the assignment to profile a writer named Frank Doyle, who is towards the end of his career as a columnist for the New York Herald, which is kind of my New York Times stand-in. But he was a longtime liberal Lion columnist who also writes a lot about baseball in a very elegiac fashion. A lot about, he grew up in Brooklyn in the 50s, and a lot about the Dodgers in those days, and romance of Ebbets Field and all that sort of stuff. And then he as a political columnist, becomes something of a neocon and Iraq war supporter, and he's had this sort of flame out. And he's become, when I started the book, people getting canceled was not really a thing. But what had happened was Don Imus said these really, really terrible things about these Rutgers women's basketball players, these terrible racist remarks, and he got taken off the air. And it was one of those cases, it was one of the first cases where you had someone whose job their whole life had been to be provocative, cross a line, / the culture was changing in a way where these provocations, people didn't find them funny anymore, you know? So that was who I kind of had in mind with this particular thing, but at any rate, what happens to Frank is what we now very commonly understand as he gets canceled for making a very dumb sort of racist remark. And Sam gets hired to do this profile that will kind of rehabilitate him. And they start by going to a Mets game together. And that now is the 4th chapter in the book. But that was, when I was first doing it, what I had was this idea of these two characters, this young guy who's sort of an analytics guy and this older person who is more elegiac, both in politics and in baseball, and they're at a baseball game together. So that was where it started. And that scene is still in the book, but it's a little later in the book.
Right. When, just backing up a second, when did you start writing this?
I started writing in 2014. Very soon after I finished my last novel, which was published in August of 2014, and I had started by then. The ideas, the book is set in 2009, and it was very close to that I first started thinking about doing this book in 2009, 2010. And I knew it was going to be big, and I didn't really think I had the equipment for it yet. But that's as far back as the conception goes. And in fact, when I sent an email out to a bunch of people about the book, I heard from an old grad school buddy of mine. I got my MFA in 2004, 2005. And he reminded me that I had talked about writing something with this title, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, back then. Because he'd actually, I'd mentioned it at a post-workshop drinks at a bar, that I had been reading Bill James, the statistician, and that he had this stat called The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, and that it was such a great title. I had to write something for the title. And then he threatened to steal it. Quite seriously. He wasn't just sort of busting my chops. He was like, well, you shouldn't have told me that, because you're right, it's a great title. But anyway, I gave him 15 years. And I still beat him. So anyway, that's how old the title is. I'd say the conception of the book is probably a decade old, and the writing of it has been in the last 6 years.
What were you doing personally in 2009?
In 2009, I was working at Harper's, where I am working now. I was relatively recent there, and that was the year that my first book, a nonfiction book called The Whole 5 Feet, came out, and I had started writing my first Sophie Wilder, my first novel. And what often happens to me, at least when you're working on one big project, is you start to develop the ideas that will be the next thing. And there's a bit of a Darwinian process of different ideas of fighting it out in your head, and such that by the time you get to the end of that novel, you kind of know what the next one's going to be. Mm-hmm. So I finished Sophie Wilder quite sure that this was going to be my next one. This is 2012 or so. And I knew it was going to be big, so I needed a little break. So I decided I was going to write a short story. The short story actually turned into my second novel, okay, Arts and Entertainments. So then as soon as I finished that, I really knew, okay, I'm doing this.
So you knew it was going to be big, though, always?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew. Those are the kinds of books that I love the most. And I really like a book that you can get absorbed in. I, I read, say, I don't right now with a newborn, but under normal circumstances, I read 50 to 100 pages a day. So like a normal sized novel, I'm reading in a couple of days. So a 500, 600, 700 page novel is a novel that I'm reading over the course of a week. Or if you get into the like William Gaddis length, I'm reading it over the course of 2 weeks. And I like that experience of walking around with the book, and that isn't what happens for me with a 250-page book.
Right. I sort of, in my mind, and the sort of rock and roll access point of this, I had envisioned of you making two records and then having to make your Born to Run,
Yeah.
Like your back's against the wall and it's got to be big. But maybe it didn't happen quite like that. But
I think what you want to do is like make the book have the form that the material demands, Mm-hmm. So you don't want your desire to write a 500-page book make you turn what is 200 pages worth of material, or what would be a great short novel, into this bloated thing, So if I tried to make Sophie Wilder 500 pages, it would not have been a good book. That's the book. That's what it was supposed to be. Similarly, my second book was a very plot-driven, high-concept comedy, and it needed to be fast-paced and sort of you get in quick and you get out quick. And if it had gone any longer than 300 pages, it would have worn thin, I think. So I knew with this that I had the material that could justify doing this thing that I wanted to do.
What about 2009? Why were you thinking about it?
Well, I wanted to write about this guy who had correctly predicted the 2008 election. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm conceiving of this before the 2016 election, when a lot of these prognosticators sort of fell on their faces. But this growing sense that you could use data to predict the future, which happened to coincide with the 2008 financial collapse, which was a complete failure to predict what in retrospect seemed very obvious, Yeah. And in that case, you had a lot of people who had a lot of money invested in, they had skin in the game. They had reason to want to be able to see what was coming around the bend, and they had completely failed to do it. So that was interesting to me, and I wind up in various ways getting the financial crisis into this. And then it's the first year of the Obama administration. That was an interesting moment in terms of there was this period, I think, of enormous hopefulness in this post-Bush Obama era that curdled fairly quickly. But right in that moment was interesting to me.
Yeah. There's something throughout the book, even though it's in 2009, that seems to really suggest going from there to here. Maybe not this pandemic, but maybe that too, but just from 2009 to 20, let's say at least till 2019, but probably till today. I noticed a few things when I was kind of rereading it that I thought was kind of funny. Page 56, the flyover at the ball game, made me think of the recent flyovers we've had here during the pandemic, which are controversial, at least in my household. There's a mention of the H1N1 virus on page 113. The character takes an apartment over a slaughterhouse, which doesn't seem like a great pandemic place to live.
That one hadn't occurred to me, actually, but yeah.
Were you working? Was that something you were going for, or were there happy accidents along the way with that? Obviously, with that one.
For sure, there were accidents. I mean, I had a conversation at one point with my agent Sarah about how if I were a faster writer, this would have been considered an incredibly prescient novel. I mean, if I had gotten this out before 2016, then it would have been, I think, this like this story about the fall of an election prognosticator. I would have seemed like DeLillo-esque or something, but unfortunately, I'm a very slow writer, and so then it comes to a lot of people that are faster writers could have started a novel in 2017 that would be out right now, so then it sort of reads like, oh, he's drawing these connections between 2009 and the Trump era, but I wasn't. I was 3/4 of the way through the book when the election happened, and I tried very hard not to have that kind of backward looking. There's a kind of cheap dramatic irony that can come in a certain kind of historical work where it's recent history and you're really laying on thick the way that the books that were written in 2004, 2005 that all took place in like the summer of 2001 and end in late August, early September, and it's all I didn't want to do that, so I was far enough along in the book at that point that I just tried to be true to the thing that I had been working on for the previous couple of years, rather than trying to think through what had changed about the project because of these events.
Sure. Getting back to the title, the Index of Self-Destructive Acts is a Bill James term, a baseball term, for those who don't know Bill James. And I think it refers to the people who are a pitcher's ability to things that aren't done to him, things he does, right, he or she does to themselves, right? Balks, bad pitches, etc. So you talked about how the title of the book, you had the title first and then the book came. It struck me also that 2009 happens at least between the Moneyball, the book, 2003, where a lot of people first heard Bill James and whatnot, and the movie 2011. And the way that data, as we said, happens in this book, it seems to kind of constantly push a divide between the old and the new.
Yeah.
I'm curious, because you work at Harper's and you work in magazine. Did the relationship that has with the magazine and the journalism world, do you think that's a big effect on why that became a part of the book?
Well, there was certainly part of that. I mean, so a bunch of this is set in a magazine that bears no resemblance to Harper's, I will say, because it's a magazine that's been bought by this young social media mogul who's trying to advance it into the future. And that Harper's is sort of keeps fighting for the old guard. That's not our MO, is getting out in front of the trends in terms of technology and publishing, but it does take place, a lot of it, at this magazine, The Interviewer, where Sam comes to work, and I did bring some of my experience in magazines into that stuff. What I will say about the kind of data-driven versus the kind of analytics versus storytelling, or however you want to put it. I didn't want to just set it up in this schematic way. So it's not as if just like Sam stands for one of these things and Frank stands for the other, and then they go at it. They're real people who happen to have these kind of interests or sensibilities. But the other thing that I really didn't want it to do is be about me advancing a particular argument. So I actually think there's a lot to be said for having some amount of rigor when talking about things like politics or baseball, for that matter. I think the introduction of statistical analysis into some of these fields has been good. And, the alternative when it came to politics was, kind of the Tom Friedman, I talked to my cabbie in the airport, from the airport to like my hotel in Saudi Arabia, and then I tell you this is what is going to happen in Saudi Arabia next year because they're ready to unleash their innovation and whatever. There was just a lot of bullshit, and no one was ever held to account for just being wrong all the time. So I do think the introduction of some rigor has been a good thing, but as with so many stuff, it can go too far in the other direction, and there can be a huge problem with overconfidence, where people think that if their model says X, then that's what's going to happen. And two, just a sense of these models cannot offer a comprehensive picture of the world. There's just a lot of stuff that gets left out, and a lot of that is what storytelling is for.
There, beyond data and its uses in whatever, politics, baseball, business, there seems to be throughout the book a tension between, kind of science and magic a little bit. I mean, I'm thinking about Lucy gets sick and she goes sees a psychic. Eddie takes comfort in Herman Nash, a street corner preacher, and someone of very much privilege who's seen kind of the most real, him being a veteran and a soldier, seeing some things that other people in the book had not seen. He's the one that goes to a street corner preacher for comfort and healing. I think all of your books so far have I think had some characters that are longing in some sense, and looking for answers, oftentimes in religion, but just beyond what that they have. And I'm curious how you feel about that, and what you see, how you see those characters in your books as a thread.
Well, it seems to me a fact about human nature, certainly about the humans who I know and about myself, that there are certain just kind of fundamental needs that cannot be met by the sort of scientific materialist view of reality. Whether that view is correct or not. Maybe the answer is it's correct, and nonetheless it's not sufficiently nourishing for us, and so we throw ourselves into various lies and mistakes and myth or whatever. Or maybe the answer is that it's incomplete in some way, and that's why it's not sufficient to our needs. A nice thing about it being a novelist as opposed to being a sort of theorist is you don't have to propose an answer to that question. But what you can do is just depict this human need and the different ways it manifests itself. So yeah, I think that's a huge part of what's going on for all of my characters is this sense of trying to find something to fulfill those needs.
There's this one thing that's, and even in the passage you read, that is really exciting as I got into your books. As right away in the passage you read, Max Blakeman comes up, and Max has been in all three of your books, right? It seems like you're almost kind of building a cast of characters a little bit, but also a world that largely resembles Manhattan, but has little differences too at times, or when I'm picturing it. Is that what attracts you to kind of bring people back?
Well, the first novel I didn't write with any view in mind that it was going to be the first in a series of dealing with these sets of characters. And then in this, when I came up with the idea for the second novel, which had to do with a failed actor whose ex-girlfriend has become very famous, and they were both struggling young actors together, and she made it and he did not, and he winds up selling a sex tape of theirs, and I actually it was conceived based on as a modern retelling of an Edith Wharton story, but in any case that seemed to me like that would be the contemporary version of this story that Wharton was telling. And as I said before, I had just I thought it was just going to be a short story, but I realized at a certain point that I already had an actor that there was in the first novel a character with a very small walk-on role who was described as someone who'd been in like a couple of Law and Order episodes. And I had no sense at the time that I was writing him. It was a party scene. And at that point, I was going to a lot of parties like that had some writers and some musicians and different people. And there was invariably an actor who had been in like one Law and Order episode, or they'd been in two. And like in one, they were the victim, and in the other, they were the assailant, you know. And so I just thought that for verisimilitude's sake, I just stuck this guy into this scene. And lo and behold, a year later, I want to write about an actor, and I thought, well, if the trajectory he was on would leave him where I need him to be, and then I knew that I had this apparatus with this character, Max Blakeman, who worked at this magazine, to get him set up into this gossip world and all this other stuff. And so it meant that I didn't have to kind of start over and building out the whole world. And then I kind of knew before I was done with that one, that this one, even though none of these, you know, Sam is not in either of the previous novels, Frank is not in either of the previous novels, I kind of had a sense of how I could build it out from that one. But I don't know if I'll keep doing that or not, but it's certainly, it's fun, and it's fun to have people respond to it. People have read all the books, and people had read the first two. When I said, you know, my new one's coming out, I had a couple of people asking me like, oh, was Blakeman in it? You know, and it was fun to get asked that, and fun to be able to say, yes, he is. But it's also not something that, you know, people, they're not a trilogy. They don't build on each other in a way where you need to read the others to appreciate this book.
Yeah, but marketing people love a trilogy, though, I'll tell you that. You know, you grew up in New York, your books take place in New York. But this book, I think, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think has more characters that are new to New York, you know, Sam and Lucy. And I really like that. I'm a Midwestern transplant. I've been here 20 years, but I still really liked those characters. And I'm curious if I want to say, I especially like the idea that Lucy kind of wasn't planning on staying in New York. And I don't know if I've ever read in a novel a character that wasn't coming to New York to kind of make it. She was just kind of like, we're going to live here for a year and then go back to the Midwest and have kids or whatever. Did it allow you to write about New York differently, do you think, or something? Why was there something freeing? Was there something wide-eyed you could do with that? With those characters?
Yeah, I think there was definitely some of that. And I think it also was just a test of my imagination to try and, I mean, there are 7 main characters in this book, 7 characters who get some chapters from their point of view. And every one of them differs from me in some really important way. None of them is like the Chris Beha stand-in, you know. And so one of the ways that I wanted to try and imagine these different perspectives coming together is to imagine these characters coming from elsewhere. One book that I was reading when I was first sort of conceiving of this is the Balzac novel Lost Illusions, which centers around a character coming from the provinces to Paris to make it as a writer. And Balzac is very cynical about this stuff, is very sharp about literary culture in 19th century Paris. But it's one of these 19th century books have this type, which is the type of the young man from the provinces. And the first section of this book is called The Young Man from the Provinces. And one of the characters, who is a literature graduate student, starts referring to Sam this way, in this very knowing way, as the young man from the provinces. And so I wanted to be knowing about it, but I also did want to write that the person who comes from out of town to the big city to try and make it? And are they going to stick to their ideals? You know, are they going to compromise themselves in order to make it? Are they going to make it or not? There's just an inherent drama to that, which is one of the reasons why it is one of the major kind of archetypes of the novel.
Yeah, two quick ones, and then we'll do some Q&A. This one, just for me, the book takes place, I think, during a single baseball season. Is that right? It's a Mets season, or it's everyone's baseball season, but it's largely the Mets are discussed. Yet you are a Yankees fan.
Yes.
Why did you make it Mets, not Yankees?
Well, I mean, I joked, I probably shouldn't even say this joke, but that was sort of my great act of cultural appropriation in this novel, was that I was going to write from the marginalized view of the Mets fan versus the Yankees fans who are kind of central to New York culture. But really, Frank Doyle, and once you read the book, I hope people will understand this. He just is a Mets fan. You know, that's who he would be. First of all, someone who grew up in the 50s in Brooklyn and was a Dodgers fan, that's what they would do after the Dodgers left town, is they would become Mets fans. They would never start following the Yankees. So there was that. And then the Mets are the team that sort of can't get out of their own way. The Mets are if you know, this impulse towards self-destruction, being a major theme of the book, that's the Mets. So
yeah, right.
And it was. I will just say, as a quick aside, this game that the two of them go to, it's the first game that opened Citi Field, the new Mets Stadium, in 2009, and I had this idea that that's the game that they would go to.
Yeah.
And I had already started writing it when I realized I needed to know what happened with the game. And I actually got one of my interns at Harper's to go track down from the major league offices a DVD of the recording of the game. And I watched the game many times. And two things happened during the game. Two things really happened. One, at a certain point early in the game, a cat runs out into the field, which is one of these things that happens sometimes in baseball, that a guy like Frank is going to turn into an omen, you know? Right. And so they get in this fight about whether this cat is a sign of something, you know? And he says, you know, that's not something that your numbers can capture. And Waxworth says, well, sure, if it makes a difference, it will show up in the, you know, but that really happened in that game. And it was a thing that allowed me to, and then the other thing that really happened in the game was that for those who know baseball, you know that balks, which are one of these self-destructive acts that this index combines, are incredibly rare. It's like one of the rarest outcomes that happens in baseball. It's sort of a procedural error. The pitcher does, you know, something while standing on the mound that they're not allowed to do, and then the base runner is allowed to take another base. The Mets lost this game because there was a man on third base and the pitcher balked, and so the winning run scored. And again, this is not something I knew was going to happen. And it was so perfect as a way to allow me to introduce this concept of the index of self-destructive acts. But all of that is just itself in this meta way was a reminder to me of just the way that the world works, that these kinds of synchronicities happen.
Oh, sounds great. I'm going to go to some reader questions here. Here is a good one, I think, from Lacey Crawford. I'd love to hear about the evolution of Margot's character, since she ends up in some way holding the book's heart by the end. She's a bit of a foil of the young male rational statistician, but also remains Cordelia. Where did she come from, and how did she develop for you?
Thank you, Lacey. That's a great question. So I said that all these characters, none of these characters are a like stand-in for me. But this character, who's a young woman, about 10 years younger than I am, is probably the closest there is in the book to a stand-in for me in terms of she's a graduate student in literature, which I did not do. I got an MFA in writing, but I thought I came very close to getting a PhD or attempting. I did not come close to getting one, but I came close to starting down that path to get a PhD in comparative literature. And she is a kind of would-be poet, which is what I wanted to do before I gave up and did the relatively debased path of being a novelist instead. And so I put a lot of myself into that character. And I do think, and she's also in the sort of debate such as there is between Sam and Frank. She also is the person who's kind of operating in the middle ground or trying to operate in a place of uncertainty about these things, which is, I think, as I said, something of the place that a novelist tries to occupy. So I think if she comes through as being the heart of the book, that's great to hear, and I think that's a lot of it is just that she's got a ton of me in her.
Wow. Cool. I didn't know. That's a great answer. Anonymous attendee writes, this novel is generally written as a realist novel, but when all the threads come together at the end, there are a series of unlikely coincidences that bring the plot to a head. Can you discuss the use of coincidence at the end of the novel?
Sure. So I feel like I've set this up nicely by saying what I said before about the game, which is, the coincidences do happen in the world. And then the other place where they happen is in big realist novels. If you go back to Balzac or to George Eliot, who was very, very important to me, where they have these these different strands of plot lines that are interweaving in these big canvas novels, and they come together at the end. They do allow coincidence to play its part. So that was a conscious decision. And in fact, sometimes coincidences can feel too convenient. It's, a plot isn't working, and so you just have certain people cross paths. But there's a couple of the coincidences towards the end of the book that are actually not at all necessary to advancing the plot, or where there's very obvious solutions that could have been used instead. So I was very conscious of using coincidence in that way. One of the things that then challenges you to do as a writer is make it feel plausible, is to make that coincidence feel convincing, to convey a sense of a world in which these things, could and indeed did happen. But I also think that you don't want a sense that somehow coincidence is cheating to keep you from getting the maximum effect of the stories you're telling, So to some degree, coincidence was necessary to bring all these people together in this way, and bringing all these people together in this way at the end of the book is what gives the book its force, I think.
Yeah. From John Carr, we've talked about some of this, but there's something, a common thread throughout all your work seems to be characters wrestling with their religious faith. How does that theme figure into this work, and how has your thinking about it changed over the course of writing 3 novels?
That's a very good question. Thank you, John. I think the novel that is kind of most explicitly treated as a Catholic novel of mine is the first one, Sophie Wilder, which, I will say, without getting too deeply into biography, I am a practicing Catholic now. I was not when I wrote that novel. So that is a novel that is about that searching, that was sort of most pointed at a time where I was very much engaged in the search and was not trying to advance any kind of argument for one answer. As I've been sort of more associated with the church as a novelist, or called a Catholic novelist by various people. I've actually become warier of including it in quite as overt a way as I did in that book, which is about a character's conversion. Mm-hmm. But these books take place in a milieu, and that milieu is more or less the Irish Catholic Manhattan that I grew up in, you know. So these characters go to a school that is based on the Catholic school I went to. And so from that standpoint, you know, one way of being a Catholic novelist is like being a representative of a particular identity group within the United States, you know. Mm-hmm. It's, you know, with a quarter or a third or whatever of Americans are Catholic Americans, and you're kind of representing quote unquote Catholic experience. And lots of Catholics, including ones who go to Mass every Sunday or most Sundays, don't believe a bit of it. And when they get up out of the pew and walk outside, it makes very little difference to their daily lives. Or if it does, it has to do with cultural difference. It doesn't have to do with a particular kind of, you know, metaphysics. Mm-hmm. So you can write Catholic characters like that. And you see in like a lot of, you know, in mobster movies where they're all Italian, often they're Catholic in that sense, you know. Mm-hmm. But in a Scorsese movie, there's those are Catholic in a very different sense. You know, this was a guy who almost became a priest, and they're like deeply imbued with the philosophy of Catholicism. And so you can then be a Catholic novelist in that sense, where it is you're a Catholic novelist in the same way that someone else might be an existentialist novelist or something like that. You come to the desk with a particular view about the way the world works or something like that. I don't have an answer as to which of those I am, because I don't think that's the novelist's job to kind of to sort that out. But I am certainly aware that this tradition that I was raised in profoundly informs my view of the world, and that would have to. I mean, if it weren't coming out of my writing, then I would be doing something terribly wrong.
Right. I have a question that just jumps on what you just said, because we've talked about this before, and it's interesting to me. You have a character, Netta, who is Justin's mother in the book, and she goes to church, and church is very important to her. It's a Black church. It's in Crown Heights. That's a character that you aren't, that, you know, you, yeah. How do you approach writing a character like that? And, you know, is there more pressure on you? Do you feel, you know, internal pressure, et cetera, to get that right, or to attempt to? What do you do?
Yeah, I feel an enormous amount of pressure to get it right, both for internal reasons. It would be a failure for me as an artist to not care about getting that right. And then for external reasons, which is that if you get it wrong, you're going to hear about it. You know, so both of those come into play. I don't want to be one of those people who, one of the things that when I started this book on all sorts of levels that I told myself was, I'm just going to go for it. You know, so I had a couple of plot lines that I thought, well, maybe that should be its own book. And no, I said, no, I'm going to figure out how they all fit together. I had certain characters where I said, maybe I shouldn't write about this person. And I said, no, I'm going to go for it. Everything here is going to be, I'm going to test how good I am, because, you know, what I'm not going to do is sort of play anything safe. So I didn't want to be someone who avoided trying to depict certain characters, because I would get in trouble if I got it wrong, you know. But one thing I would say about the appropriation debate generally is that mostly it's about people getting it wrong. You know, it often gets reduced to a question of who's allowed to try X or Y. But the truth is that I think most of us agree that we're all allowed to try whatever we want. But then the people who actually know the reality that you're trying to depict are very much entitled to tell you that you got it wrong. And not only are they entitled to tell you that you got it wrong, they're entitled to be pissed off at you. for getting it wrong. You know, they're entitled to say, you got it wrong, and it looks to me like you didn't even really try. You know, which is very often what is happening when these debates, start up. So from my perspective, I feel like very few people get told you got everything right, or it feels, authentic and plausible to me, but I'm still angry at you for trying because, you know, it's not your experience. What I will say in this case is that I went to a storefront church in Crown Heights for a service. I had lived in Crown Heights for a couple of years. I became very interested in these churches while I was there. I had some sense that it would be an interesting thing to write about. At the time, you know, it actually was in 2008, 2009. I was living in Crown Heights at a time where it had just started to gentrify, and then the economic collapse happened and it kind of fell back. And anyway, I was a gentrifier in Crown Heights, and I didn't feel comfortable going into one of those churches because it felt to me a little bit like it would have been read as some kind of untoward interest, you know, like I was going as like a sociologist to watch this like culture. And interestingly, part of that was the fact that at the time I was not a churchgoer, having been raised in the church. I had stopped. When I went to the church, I was able to go as someone who shared in a fundamental way the beliefs that were undergirding their presence in the church. And I felt like I was able to participate in a way that was sincere. It was a different tradition than my own, but we shared a kind of belief. And I went not just to sort of like see it for material, but to participate. And they were incredibly welcoming to me. I definitely was the only white person in the church. I was the only person who was not a regular in the church. Everyone was aware that I was a visitor. And when the pastor got up and started the service, he said, we have a visitor here. He asked me my name. And I was, the welcome was incredible. It was actually truly one of the most welcoming feelings I've ever gotten in my life. And I don't know if I would have done it if I hadn't already decided that I was going to attempt to write this character. So I don't know if there is a lesson there or what, but it was an experience that I had because I made this decision to try and write this thing.
That's fascinating. That's really great. I think we're like getting to the end. I wanted to ask you one thing in sort of pandemic world, how, the past months or weeks have affected your creativity, or have given your own, has there been any?
Well, as you know, but not everyone will know, I had, my wife and I had a baby a month and a half ago. So I don't have, the truth is, in the best of worlds, I would not be, working on the next novel right now. So we're going through one of those periods that is naturally one of those periods in your life where you're just kind of dealing with getting through the next day and the next day and the next day. You're not thinking about what happens next month, and you're just thinking about like when you're going to get to sleep. And but we're doing it at a time where everyone is going through that for their own reason. But the truth is that, there may come a time where I look back on this period and can think through how it does or does not change what I'm doing. But I don't have the wherewithal to do that now.
Bigger picture. Do you have an idea for your next novel, or?
I do. Yes.
Working on.
I've taken some notes towards, but which I won't get into here.
All right. Well, I think that we're pretty good. Chelsea, are we?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris and Craig, for tonight's wonderful conversation. And thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. A reminder that you can buy the Index of Self-Destructive Acts at greenlightbookstore.com, and you can get $5 off before May 18th with code INDEX. Again, thanks so much, everyone, for a wonderful evening, and have a great night. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot.